Back in May 2025, the UK government signed a deal to hand over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, while leasing Diego Garcia, the largest of the islands and one that houses a joint UK-US military base, for 99 years for the cost of, on average, £101 million a year. While the debate about the pros and cons of such a deal have raged on since, there seems to have been very little progress on it. That is, until this week. On Monday, the Diego Garcia military base and British Indian Ocean Territory Bill, the bill that ratifies the deal, went through the House of Lords and was amended 4 times. So, in this video, we're going to go through a quick refresher on what the Chagos Islands deal is, explain a little about why it's controversial, why the Lords made changes to the deal, and whether ultimately the Lords could block or seriously alter the Chagos deal. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. Now, we should start this video with a brief history of Britain's relationship with the Chagos Islands. The islands were, for much of history, uninhabited. The first permanent settlements were built in the late 18th century, when the French established a copra plantation on the islands using slave labour. These settlements were ceded to the British only a few years later, in 1815, and were administered from Mauritius. By 1900, around 60% of those living on the island were descendants of the original enslaved population, and the other 40% were descendants of indentured labourers from South Asia. Those on the island began to build their own culture. They built towns, churches, schools, and even developed their own Chagosian Creole language. Now, it's important to note here that everyone living on the islands technically worked for the companies that owned and ran the coconut plantations, meaning that only the corporations owned any land on the islands. This was important because in the 1960s, after the UN had called for members to grant independence to their colonies, the UK began secret talks with the US about creating a military base on Diego Garcia, the largest of the Chagos Islands. In order to do this, the UK granted independence to Mauritius but retained the Chagos Islands, incorporating them, in 1965, into the British Indian Ocean Territory, or BIOT. Mauritius was given £3 million to compensate for the separation of Chagos, and in 1967, Britain paid £600,000 to the coconut plantations, becoming the sole property owner on the islands, and then, over 5 years, forced all those that lived there out. The UK then leased Diego Garcia to the US, allowing them to construct their military base. Fast forward to 2019, and the UN's International Court of Justice, or ICJ, found that the separation of the islands from Mauritius was unlawful, and that the UK's continuing rule would be a wrongful act. Although this wasn't legally binding, it was embarrassing, and raised fears of further action by the ICJ. It's this fear of a further binding ICJ judgment that pushed the UK into action, as it was feared that this could make the base inoperable, a fear that was only made worse as a result of Mauritius's close economic ties with China. So, in 2022, the Conservatives began negotiations with Mauritius about the Chagos Islands, but it was only in 2024, after Labour had entered office, that progress seemed to be made. In October 2024, the UK and Mauritius released a joint statement, explaining that the Chagos Islands would be handed to Mauritius, and that the UK would lease Diego Garcia from them for an initial period of 99 years. The deal was only finalised in May of 2025, with it revealed that the UK would pay an average of £101 million to lease Diego Garcia from Mauritius, with the UK repaying £165 million a year for the first 3 years, then £120 million a year plus inflation. The UK also agreed to pay £40 million into a trust to support Chagosians. However, not everyone was happy with the deal. Those on the right claim that the fears of future binding resolutions from the international community were overblown, while others were frustrated that the deal explicitly prevented the return of the Chagosian people to Diego Garcia. As this deal technically cedes British territory, the deal has to be ratified via an Act of Parliament, meaning that it has to make its way through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Through the end of last year, the bill successfully passed through the House of Commons and has, since October, been making its way through the House of Lords. As the government doesn't have a majority in the Lords, opponents of the deal stood the best chance of changing it in the Lords stages. This is exactly what happened on Monday, when the government lost 4 separate votes on the Chagos deal, with each of them significantly altering the wording of the bill. The first of these was a Tory measure that would force the government to publish the total cost of the payments made to Mauritius alongside the full methodology used in the calculation. 194 peers voted in favour and 130 voted against. The second amendment that was agreed to was a Liberal Democrat measure that would ensure parliamentary oversight over UK government spending linked to the treaty. The amendment specifically stated that MPs would be able to stop payments to Mauritius if they broke the terms of the deal. 131 peers voted in favour and 127 against. The third amendment that was agreed to was another amendment by the Liberal Democrats, which would require an amendment among the Chagosian community on whether the transfer deal adequately guaranteed their rights to resettlement. 210 voted in favour and 131 voted against. And lastly, the fourth amendment was an amendment made by Baron Craig of Radley, a former Royal Air Force commander, that proposed that payments to Mauritius would stop if the military base on Diego Garcia could no longer be used, whether that's because of environmental changes, legal restrictions, or an attack by a hostile state. This was something that former military chiefs wanted included in the bill. 132 peers voted for the amendment and 124 voted against. As all these amendments were agreed to, the bill as it currently stands includes all four amendments. If they remain as part of the bill, and the bill receives royal assent, this would require the government to reopen negotiations with Mauritius, something that could ultimately kill the deal. However, it's highly unlikely that the amendments will remain in the bill. The bill now goes back to the House of Commons, who'll have their say on whether they agree to the amendments. As Labour has a massive majority, it's highly likely that the amendments will be overturned. However, some opponents of the deal are optimistic. The government defeat in the Lords has been humiliating for Starmer, and they're hoping that, if the pressure can be sustained, then they might be able to convince President Trump to block the deal. Experts have already suggested that there are deep-seated and growing concerns in the White House over the deal, and some senior figures suggest that it's incredibly dangerous from the US national security interest. Maybe then, Trump might finish the job that the House of Lords started. If you're interested in this, we have a whole UK section in the latest issue of our magazine. There we document the rise of a new left, why this year's elections are critical at all levels, as well as the strategy Starmer ought to take to maintain power, and Farage to gain power. There's so much more in this issue too. In addition to our cover story about the new Middle East, there's also full sections dedicated to UK, EU and global news. The EU section includes our interview with fellow creator Money and Macro, where we discuss how to fix the European economy, Macron's fall from grace, and how Albania has implemented an AI minister. The global section discusses why Trump's mandate isn't quite what it seems, how politicians conquered social media, as well as our rundown of the biggest elections that happened in 2025. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special New Year offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use the code at checkout.